In the heart of Texas, an old farmer stood at the edge of ruin. His land was dry, the bank was ready to take everything, and vultures in suits circled closer each day. Yet, in the silence of his ranch, one loyal horse began to dig, as if guided by something greater. What Dusty unearthed would not only test the farmer's courage, but uncover a secret powerful enough to change his destiny forever. By late afternoon, the Texas Panhandle looked like a map of old scars. The wheat fields Henry Walker used to brag about were now a spread of clay plates split by heat, each fissure dark as a wound. Windmills on distant ranches turned slow and useless, grinding out a dry song. A red-tailed hawk circled and circled as if it, too, had forgotten what it was hunting for. Henry stood on his porch and let the light burn his eyes until the horizon blurred, and the whole place seemed to breathe with a tired, hot breath. Inside, on the kitchen table, where his wife once laid out Sunday pot roast, a single envelope had been opened and flattened with a coffee mug. Final notice. The letters were calm and official and merciless. He'd read them so many times they no longer sounded like words, only the dull knock of a hammer on a nail that had already been driven home. He lifted the mug, and the paper curled at the edges, like it wanted to get away from him. He pressed it flat again with his palm, feeling the throb in his wrist that came every time he squeezed a fence staple or swung the post maul a fraction too long. Dusty flicked his ears in the corral, close enough to hear Henry speak if he chose to. The horse's coat, sun-browned and clean as a new penny, caught the light even through a powder of dust. He stood easy, one hind hoof tipped, the way horses do when they trust the ground under them. Henry watched the rhythm of Dusty's breathing. In, out. Steady. It always settled him. He took his hat off, dragged a sleeve over his forehead, and stepped down to the yard. "It ain't your fault," Henry said as he reached the gate. Dusty lifted his head and blew warm air across Henry's knuckles, a sound like a soft cough. "Wouldn't trade you for any tractor in the county," Henry added, because talking to the horse made the quiet less sharp. Beyond the corrals, the fields spread to the fence line where mesquite had crept in over the years, thorny and patient. The wind carried the alkaline scent of baked earth, sun-cracked cedar posts, and something faint, a ghost of rain that had fallen someplace else. Henry could tell the season by smells once, back when storms came regular, and the Ogallala well still had a voice. Now the air smelled like memory. You reached for it, and it slipped between your fingers. He walked the fence, with a pair of pliers hanging from his back pocket, eyes hunting breaks that didn't matter anymore. No cattle to test the wire, no feed bill to juggle against diesel. The auction had taken the last heifers in a quiet morning that felt like laying flowers on a grave. He'd told himself it was a pause, not an ending. He told himself lots of things. On the ridge where the ground fell toward a dry creek, he stopped to breathe and to look back at the house. The paint had peeled to the silver of old boards. The porch steps sagged where his boy once jumped them 2 at a time. The kitchen window glowed yellow with late sun, a rectangle of warmth no one was inside to enjoy. He pictured Claire at the sink, her hair twisted up, humming something soft and out of tune. For years after she passed, he could swear he still heard it in the late evenings, a thread of sound under the cicadas. He didn't try to chase the memory away. He let it sit beside him, the way a tired friend sits without asking for anything. Dusty nickered. The sound snapped Henry back, and he answered with a whistle he'd used since the horse was green. Dusty came at an easy jog, head bobbing, hooves thudding light on hardpan. Up close, the gelding's eyes were dark and steady, mirrors that did not flinch. Henry ran a hand down the neck, warm, alive, and felt his shoulders drop as if he'd set down a pack. He checked the old hand dug well by habit. The bucket scraped on stone, the rope rasped. When he hauled it up, it dripped only a few sullen drops. He tipped them into the rubber tub, and Dusty lapped at them politely, as if pretending there was plenty. "Gentlemen," Henry said. "Always a gentleman." When the sun tilted, heat slid from white to gold. A truck coughed dust on the county road, then turned in at his gate. The sound set Henry's jaw before he even saw the grill. He closed the well cover and wiped his palms on his jeans. Dusty raised his head again and stood square, as if he understood when company required manners. The truck door opened with a gleaming click, and a man in pressed slacks stepped down like he was dismounting a stage. "Mr. Walker," he called, already smiling with his mouth but not his eyes. "Richard Cole. We spoke on the phone." "We sure did," Henry said. He kept his voice even. Richard glanced around as if appraising a house for sale, which he was. His gaze ticked off the porch, the roof line, the barn doors hanging a little crooked, the fields, the corral. "Hot one," he said. "Mind if we sit a minute?" Henry gestured toward the porch, and Richard trod up the boards like they were a little beneath him. Inside, Henry poured 2 glasses of tea, thin and warm, and set one near the folded letter without apology. They sat with the air between them buzzing faintly with insects and whatever else men bring into a space when one has something the other intends to take. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," Richard said, like men say when they enjoy carrying it. "But the grace period has run its course. The bank needs an answer by Friday. You sign today, we can arrange a move-out date that's comfortable for you. You don't sign, the process will be less accommodating." "I've known less accommodating things," Henry said, and he let his eyes wander to the photograph on the far wall. Claire, wind-blown in a churchyard, one hand on their boy's shoulder. Sun caught the edge of her smile. The world had been large that day and full of choices. Richard followed his glance, measured it, then set his glass down with a soft tap. "The market's not going to get kinder. Take the offer, Mr. Walker. Start fresh." There's no shame in that. Henry thought of what shame did and did not look like. Shame was selling a bull you'd bred for 5 seasons to a man who'd never step into his own pens. Shame was the quiver in your voice when you told the auctioneer, "No reserve." Shame was a letter that said, "Final notice," in a font that looked patient. "My family's under that dirt," Henry said softly. "I don't start fresh by leaving them behind." Richard's polite smile cooled a degree. "You've got until Friday." He left in a cloud of pale road dust that drifted across the porch and settled on Henry's boots. Henry stayed sitting until the dust fell. When he stood, the boards creaked the way old bones do. He folded the letter again and again and slid it back under the coffee mug, like tucking a child into bed without blankets. Dusk drew color from the sky, laying lavender and brass across the pasture. Dusty moved to the far end of the corral and stood near the old capped-off well. Just stood, ears angled, as if listening to something under the ground. Henry watched without thinking much of it. Animals did peculiar things. Cows bawled at trains, dogs stared at walls, horses pointed their bodies toward distances a man couldn't name. He set about the small work that remains even when the big work is gone. He checked the hinges on the barn door, pounded a nail home where a board had lifted, swept the feed room, though there was little to sweep. The barn smelled of dry leather and dust, and the sweet ghost of oats. A broken halter hung on a nail. He did not throw it away. Night laid itself over the place with the intimacy of a blanket someone you loved once pulled to your chin. The first stars came cold and indifferent. In the house, he lit a single lamp, whose yellow threw a kind light on rough things. On the counter, he set 2 plates and then took one away. He sat with a bowl of beans and cornbread, ate slow, listening to the cricket racket outside and the tiny clicks of a house that was always expanding or shrinking depending on weather and time. After he washed the bowl and left it upside down to dry, he went to the small room where the pictures were. He did not turn the light on. He knew them by feel. He touched the frames lightly. Claire's, smooth with use. The boys, nicked at the corner from a move years ago, when moving still meant you went somewhere together and came back together. "I'm hanging on," he said into the quiet. "Best I can." He stepped back onto the porch and let the cool lift the heat from his skin. Dusty was a shape against the darker shape of the fence, head low, resting. Henry whistled, and the horse's ears pricked. That was when it happened. The sound that would later mean everything, and right now meant only a question. A hollow thock, deliberate, like a wooden mallet on packed soil. 1, 2. Then a pause. Then again. Dusty had lifted a forefoot and let it fall just once, then again, in a rhythm that wasn't restlessness. It sounded like a tension. "What is it, boy?" Henry asked. He climbed down and walked toward the corral, gravel popping under his boots. Dusty stood at the corner nearest the capped well, nose stretched toward the ground, ears fixed forward. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't asking for feed. He was pointing, as surely as if he'd raised a hand. Henry crouched and pressed his palm to the earth. It held the day's heat as a skillet holds it, solid, unwavering. He left his hand there until warmth met the bones of his wrist. He thought, only for a second, that beneath the warm there was a cooler breath. Probably nothing. Maybe the night itself. "Go on then," he said, rubbing Dusty's jaw. "Show me tomorrow." Back inside, he set the lamp down low and stretched out on the bed without undressing, boots side by side like sentries. The house ticked and sighed, and the wind eased its body along the north wall. He closed his eyes and saw, with a clarity that was almost kindness, his wife stringing lights on the porch for a birthday, his boy sluicing water from a trough onto his own bare head and yelping at the shock of cold. Scenes assembled themselves as if the mind could make a harvest out of longing. He let them play, because sometimes that is what keeps a man breathing. Toward midnight he woke to the old instinct that has nothing to do with clocks. The room was the color of the inside of a pocket. The night smelled of creosote and iron. Through the screen, he heard it again, quiet but certain. Thock, thock, a heartbeat from the ground itself. He did not rise. He lay there and listened. In that listening, the hot day fell away. The noise of worry thinned. Between one breath and the next, Henry felt something he had not felt in a long while, The slender, shy animal that shows up before hope has the courage to say its name. Morning would come with its blunt light and its letters, and its men in clean shirts. He knew that. He also knew that for a handful of hours, the ranch belonged to darkness and to the small, honest sounds of a horse in a pen and a man who had decided, if only for this night, not to quit. He turned on his side, facing the window, and let the faint rhythm guide him back toward sleep. Outside, Dusty stood his quiet watch near the old well, ears pricked toward whatever lay beneath the cracked earth. The day burned white over the panhandle, the kind of heat that seemed to press down from all directions at once. Henry Walker leaned against the porch post, hat brim shading his eyes, and watched the county road throw up a haze of dust. A truck engine droned closer, heavy and sure. By the time the vehicle turned through his gate, Henry already knew it wasn't a neighbor coming to borrow a wrench or share a story. Neighbors drove beat-up pickups, dented from fence lines and gravel hauls. This one gleamed black, polished until the sun itself seemed to ride its hood. Richard Cole stepped out the driver's side, crisp as if he'd just walked out of an office downtown instead of a farm road that hadn't seen rain in months. His shirt was starched white, his tie a dark line against the glare, and his shoes looked like they had never touched dust until now. He smiled the way salesmen smile. Practiced, not warm. "Mr. Walker," he said. "Afternoon." Henry nodded, but didn't move from the post. "Afternoon," he replied, voice even. Dusty, out in the corral, lifted his head and studied the stranger, ears flicking, eyes steady. Henry felt a kind of echo in that gaze, measured, cautious, unwilling to give away more than necessary. Richard gestured toward the porch. "May we sit?" "This won't take long." Henry led him to the steps, pulled 2 chairs out, and fetched a jar of sun tea from the kitchen. He set a glass down for Richard, another for himself, both sweating warm already. On the small table between them lay the envelope Henry had opened that morning, the one that had turned the day heavy before it began. Richard's eyes landed on it like a hawk spotting prey. "You've read the letter," Richard said. "So you understand. The bank has been patient, more than patient, but the deadline is here. Friday, Mr. Walker. That's when grace turns into foreclosure." Henry sipped his tea. "I know how to read." Richard chuckled, polite but sharp. "Then you know your options. You sign now, we arrange a clean transfer, some money in your pocket to start fresh. No sheriff at the door, no headlines in the local paper. That's dignity, Mr. Walker. A chance to walk away with it still intact." Henry's jaw worked. He thought of dignity, what it meant when you'd buried your wife under the cottonwoods behind the house, when your boy's baseball glove still hung by the barn door. Dignity wasn't a line in a contract. It was something you held on to when the world told you to let go. Dusty pawed once at the ground. Henry glanced at him, then back at Richard. "You ever built a fence in July?" he asked. Richard blinked. "Excuse me? You ever dig a post hole when the earth is so dry it sparks under the auger? You ever run your hands along barbed wire till your palms split and still tie it tight because cattle will test it if you don't?" Henry leaned forward. "That's dignity. Not some paper you want me to sign." Richard's smile thinned. He set his glass down, untouched. "Mr. Walker, I'm not here to debate philosophy. I'm here to give you a way out. The market is unforgiving. The land doesn't yield. You know this better than anyone. Take the offer." The air between them felt thick, buzzing with cicadas, heavy with dust. Henry thought of Claire's voice, gentle but firm, the way she'd once told him the land was more than soil. It was memory, promise, and blood all at once. He thought of his son's laughter running down the rows of wheat. To sign would be to erase them. "I'll think about it," Henry said, but his voice carried no promise. Richard studied him, eyes sharp behind the calm. "Friday," he repeated. "Don't wait until it's too late." He left in a rush of engine noise and swirling grit. The dust hung long after the truck disappeared down the road, a gray veil across the sky. Henry sat still, tea glass sweating onto the table, letter pressed under his palm. He could almost hear the tick of time counting down. When the dust finally settled, Henry rose and walked the fence line again, as though putting one foot in front of the other might anchor him. Dusty trailed near the corral fence, watching. The gelding's eyes followed Henry with a patience that felt ancient. Night came slow, settling purple and orange across the horizon. Henry ate alone at the kitchen table, beans and bread, the letter still spread beside his plate. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. The words were branded in his mind. Final notice. After dinner, he stepped outside, searching the sky for stars. The air smelled of cedar posts warming and cooling, of dry weeds crisp underfoot. From the corral, Dusty moved to the same corner near the old well, pawing once, then twice. The sound was hollow against the packed earth. Henry frowned. "What's got into you, boy?" he muttered. He leaned on the fence and watched. But Dusty only stood there, head lowered, ears pricked toward the ground. Henry rubbed the back of his neck, unsettled in a way he couldn't name. Inside, he folded the letter again and slid it beneath the lamp. His house creaked as it cooled, whispering like an old companion. Henry lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. He could still feel Richard's gaze, still smell the dry paper of the letter, still hear Dusty's hoof striking earth with quiet insistence. Sleep came late and thin. But just before it claimed him, Henry thought he heard it again through the night air. A steady thock, thock, as if the land itself were knocking to be heard. He rolled to his side, listening, caught between fear and something that felt almost like a promise. The next morning broke with a weak gray light that bled slowly over the horizon. Henry Walker stirred in his bed before the rooster even bothered to crow. His eyes opened to the ceiling beams he'd stared at for decades, beams that once echoed with the laughter of a family now gone. The smell of old cedar lingered, mixed with the faint tang of dust drifting through the open window. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat for a long while, palms pressed to his knees, shoulders heavy with the weight of the night before. The letter on the table still waited like a wound that refused to close. He had left it beneath the lamp, as if tucking it away could quiet its message. But there was no quiet when you knew time was counting down. Friday. It rang in his head like a church bell he couldn't shut out. Henry dressed slowly, buttoning his faded shirt, tying the same bandana he used to wear when his wife was alive. Claire used to fuss about how he tied it too loose, how it slipped down his neck when he worked the fields. He could almost hear her voice now, gentle and amused, floating in from the kitchen where she once sang over the skillet. The memory tightened his throat. He moved to the small room at the back of the house, the one that had turned into a shrine without his meaning it to. The photographs were there, lined on a shelf worn thin at the edges. Claire's picture in her Sunday dress, wind tugging at her dark hair. Next to her, their boy Michael, grin wide, a baseball cap tipped back on his head. That cap still hung in the barn, dust gathering in the crease of the brim. Henry reached for the picture frame but stopped short, his fingers trembling an inch from the glass. Touching it felt like admitting they weren't coming back. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered instead, voice cracking. He lingered on the boy's face, then turned toward the door before grief pulled him under again. Outside, the dawn laid a pale wash across the land. Dusty grazed along the fence line, swishing his tail in the cool air. Henry walked over, boots scuffing the gravel. Dusty lifted his head and came forward, nostrils flaring, eyes calm. Henry pressed his forehead to the horses, drawing strength from the warm hide. "It's just us, old boy," he murmured. "Just us." He saddled up despite having nowhere to go. Riding had become his way of thinking, of breathing when the world felt too heavy. Dusty stepped out with the steady rhythm of a horse that knew his rider's weight as well as his own. They followed the dry creek bed south, where once water had run fast enough for the kids to float sticks downstream. Now, it was nothing but cracked mud, weeds brittle as bone, and the faint memory of flow. The ride carried Henry into the folds of his past, whether he wanted it or not. He remembered Claire spreading a blanket beneath the cottonwoods, the children chasing dragonflies, laughter spilling into the summer air. He remembered the scent of fried chicken she'd packed for picnics, the sweetness of lemonade sweating in glass jars. The images came sharp, so alive he almost believed he could reach out and pluck them from the air. Then they slipped, leaving only silence and the ache of loss. Dusty halted suddenly, ears pinned forward. Henry followed the horse's gaze toward the old homestead windmill, its blades rusted and frozen. Beneath it lay the remains of the garden Claire once tended, rows of corn and tomatoes now reduced to weeds and empty soil. He dismounted, crouched, and sifted a handful of dirt through his fingers. It was powder. Lifeless. He closed his fist tight until the grit pressed into his skin. "This land fed us," he said softly, more to himself than to Dusty. Claire believed it would never fail. He stared at the horizon, eyes burning. "But it has. Or maybe I failed it first." Dusty blew through his nostrils and nudged Henry's shoulder as if scolding him for thinking such thoughts. Henry patted the horse's neck, letting the gesture pull him back from despair. He mounted again, guiding Dusty toward the ridge where the whole ranch unfolded beneath them. From that height, Henry saw not only ruin, but also stubborn beauty. The sun struck the land in a way that made even the parched soil glow faintly gold. The wind whispered through dry grasses like an old hymn. For a moment, he felt Claire's presence at his side, her hand slipping into his, her voice repeating the words she'd said 1,000 times. "This land keeps its secrets, Henry. One day it'll give them back if you listen hard enough." He let the words settle in him, heavy and light at the same time. Maybe that was what Dusty had been doing at the old well, listening harder than Henry ever had. By noon, heat rolled in again, fierce and demanding. Henry returned to the house, unsaddled Dusty, and gave him what little water remained in the trough. The horse drank slow, respectful, never wasting a drop. Henry watched the muscles ripple along his neck and thought of how much life still lingered in that body despite the barrenness around them. Back in the kitchen, he set a plate on the table, out of habit more than hunger. He couldn't bring himself to eat, so he sat staring at the empty chair across from him, the one where Claire used to scold Michael for talking with his mouth full. He rubbed his temples, fighting the weight pressing in on all sides, memories, deadlines, loneliness. Afternoon shadows stretched long. The silence of the ranch was broken only by the rasp of cicadas and the occasional groan of old wood. Henry rose, walked to the window, and saw Dusty once again at that same corner of the corral near the well, pawing the earth with steady insistence. A hollow sound carried faintly on the hot air. Henry narrowed his eyes, unsettled but curious. "What in God's name are you after, boy?" he muttered. He didn't move to check. Not yet. Something in him was not ready to follow the horse's message, whatever it was. Instead, he returned to the room of photographs, sat heavily in the chair, and closed his eyes. He let Claire's words echo again. "This land keeps its secrets." He wondered if Dusty had heard them too. When night came, the stars glimmered cold and sharp above the ranch. Henry sat on the porch, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, and thought of the years that had carved him down to bone. He thought of what was gone, and what, just maybe, might still remain hidden beneath the soil, waiting for a horse's hooves to bring it to light. By midweek, the sky over the panhandle was a sheet of steel, hard and gleaming with heat. Henry had finished patching a section of sagging fence and stood with his hands on his hips, sweat darkening his shirt in wide patches. Dusty shifted in the corral, tail swishing at flies, head lifting as if he sensed something approaching long before Henry did. A low hum of an engine carried on the wind. It wasn't the clattering rattle of a ranch truck or the grumble of a tractor. This sound was smoother, deeper, polished like the machines you saw in city dealerships. Henry turned toward the county road just as a silver sedan rolled through the gate, tires crunching gravel with an arrogance that didn't belong on country ground. The driver stepped out, sunglasses flashing in the sun, suit jacket slung casually over one shoulder. He looked more like he was stepping into a boardroom than into Henry's battered yard. The man's hair was combed neat, his shoes, Italian leather by the shine of them, sank an inch into the dust. He smiled with an ease that felt rehearsed. "Mr. Walker?" His voice was smooth, clipped with confidence. "Ethan Miller. I was hoping we could talk." Henry didn't answer right away. He studied the man the way he'd study a bull he didn't trust, watching for the twitch that meant trouble. Dusty snorted, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the stranger with the same suspicion Henry felt rising. Ethan extended a hand, the gesture open, friendly. Henry accepted it because manners ran deep in him, but he gripped hard enough to remind the younger man whose land he was standing on. "What's your business?" Henry asked. "I'll be direct," Ethan said, brushing dust from his trousers with a flick that showed how little he liked being there. "I represent a development group out of Dallas. We've been looking at opportunities in this part of the state. Resorts, ranch-style retreats, energy projects, you name it. And your property caught my attention. Beautiful spread, excellent location." He gestured at the horizon like it was a painting he planned to hang in his office. Henry gave a dry laugh. "Location for what? Coyotes and mesquite?" Ethan chuckled politely, as though humoring an old man. "You'd be surprised what people will pay for authenticity these days. Wide open land, big skies, a taste of cowboy living. We can turn this place into something that thrives again. And you, mister, Walker, you'd walk away with more money than the bank is offering. A lot more." The words hung in the air, tempting like shade on a hot day. Henry felt them tug at his exhaustion, his fear, the ache in his bones that whispered maybe it was time to quit. He glanced at the house, at the peeling paint, at the empty corral where cattle once stood thick as a herd should. For a heartbeat, he imagined what more money might fix. Dusty let out a sharp whinny that cut through the thought like a blade. The horse pawed at the ground, ears pinned, as if the words themselves offended him. Henry's mouth set in a line. "I'm not selling to a man who sees my home as a vacation brochure," Henry said. Ethan's smile flickered, but didn't break. "I understand loyalty. I admire it, in fact. But loyalty won't pay debts. The bank is breathing down your neck. I happen to know that much. I'm giving you an alternative, a way to step into the future instead of being buried by the past." Henry looked him dead in the eye. "The past is all I've got left worth keeping." The younger man studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to press harder. Then he shrugged, slipping his sunglasses back on. "Think about it, mister. Walker offers like mine don't stay on the table forever. I'll be back." He slid into the sedan and drove off, a gleaming ghost swallowed by the dust he left behind. The road fell silent again, only cicadas carrying their endless rasp. Henry leaned on the fence, watching the trail of dust dissolve. His chest tightened with the knowledge that the man wasn't wrong. Time was against him. But the way Ethan's eyes had wandered across the ranch, calculating, possessive, made Henry's stomach turn. He rubbed Dusty's nose, grounding himself in the horse's steady presence. "Don't worry," Henry said softly. "We ain't selling to him." That evening, after chores that felt more like rituals than necessity, Henry sat on the porch with a jar of coffee gone cold. The air was thick, the horizon bruised purple with a heat haze. His mind wouldn't rest. The bank pressed from one side, slick men from the city pressed from the other, and he stood in the middle, holding on by his fingernails. Dusty moved again to that corner near the capped well, pawing the earth with the same measured insistence. Henry squinted, unsettled. "Not tonight," he muttered, unwilling to face another mystery. But the sound of hoof striking hard ground echoed through the night, long after Ethan's polished words had faded. Inside, he returned to the room of photographs and lit the small lamp. Claire's eyes looked back at him, calm and knowing, as if she'd heard every word spoken that day. Henry sat down heavy, elbows on his knees, and whispered, "They're circling, Claire. They want what's ours. I don't know how long I can hold them off." For a long moment, he let the silence answer. Then he rose, blew out the lamp, and listened to the rhythm outside. The thwack of Dusty's hoof against earth. Steady as a heartbeat, stubborn as hope itself. The morning after Ethan's visit arrived with a dull stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Henry Walker was sitting on the porch with his second cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He hadn't slept much. Ethan's words still ran through his head like a thorn stuck under the skin. "More money than the bank," he'd said. But Henry couldn't shake the image of Ethan's polished shoes sinking into his dust, the kind of man who looked at the land and saw only profit. The screen door creaked behind him, but it wasn't the house. It was the sound of footsteps on gravel. He looked up and saw Sarah Lopez walking down the road, a basket balanced in her arms. She was small, but carried herself with the strength of someone who worked harder than most men. Sarah taught at the little schoolhouse 10 miles down the highway, but she also tended her widowed father's garden and looked in on neighbors when she could. "Morning, Henry," she called, her voice bright despite the heat. "I brought something for you." He stood, brushing his palms down his jeans. "You didn't have to." Sarah climbed the steps and set the basket on the porch table. The smell of fresh cornbread and apples rose, warm and comforting. "I figured you might not be eating right," she said, hands on her hips in mock scolding. "Man can't fight battles on an empty stomach." Henry gave a faint smile, the first in days. "You sound like Claire." The mention of his late wife softened Sarah's expression. "She'd have my hide if I let you waste away." She glanced out at the fields, brow furrowing. "It's worse every time I come by." "The land looks tired." Henry followed her gaze. The soil stretched in cracked lines, the horizon shimmered in heat waves. "Tired's one word for it." He sank back into the porch chair. "Bank says I've got until Friday." "A man from Dallas came yesterday, too. Wants to turn this place into some kind of playground for rich folks." Sarah sat opposite him, folding her hands. "And you? And me?" He shook his head. "I made a promise." But promises don't pay notes. They sat in silence for a while, cicadas filling the air with their rasp. Sarah finally spoke, her tone quieter. "When I was a girl, my grandmother used to tell us stories about this land. She said the Comanche believed these plains were alive, that the ground breathed, listened, even answered if you knew how to hear it. Maybe it sounds foolish now, but I like to think there's truth in it." Henry let the words settle. He thought of Dusty pawing at the same patch of earth, night after night, the hollow sound of his hoof echoing in Henry's chest. He thought of Claire's voice saying this land keeps its secrets. The idea of soil that listened didn't feel so foolish anymore. Sarah rose, dusting off her skirt. "You've carried more than your share, Henry. Don't let slick-talking men trick you into giving up what's yours. Sometimes the land does find a way to answer back." Henry stood as well. "You believe that?" "I do," she said simply. "And I believe Dusty does too." She glanced toward the corral, where the horse stood as if he had been eavesdropping. His ears flicked forward and he gave a soft whinny. Sarah smiled. "See? He's already agreeing with me." She left him with the basket, walking back down the dusty road, her figure shrinking into the heat shimmer. Henry watched her go, feeling lighter than when she arrived. That evening, Henry carried the cornbread into the kitchen and ate more than he had in a week. He felt strength return to his body, a steadiness in his hands. Later, as the sky blushed orange and purple, he sat on the porch again. Dusty moved to that same stubborn corner near the old well, pawing once, twice. Henry sighed, setting down his cup. "All right, boy," he muttered. "Maybe tomorrow I'll take a closer look." But even as he turned inside for the night, he felt Sarah's words following him like a shadow. Sometimes the land does find a way to answer back. The Texas night fell heavy, the air as warm as a held breath, and thick with the hum of cicadas. Henry Walker sat on the porch with his boots propped on the railing, the last sip of coffee cooling at his elbow. His body ached from chores that barely mattered anymore, fixing fence, hauling water from a nearly empty trough, but habit had carried him through the motions. He stared across the yard, listening to the hush that came when the sun surrendered, when the wide land gave up its color and waited for the moon. Out in the corral, Dusty shifted. The horse's silhouette was cut from silver, head lowered, tail swishing in the faint breeze. Henry watched him with the comfort of routine. Dusty was his anchor, the steady rhythm against a life that had begun to tilt. But tonight, the gelding wasn't resting. His ears pinned forward, his body tense. Then the sound came. Thock, hoof against hard ground. A pause, then another. Henry set his cup down, leaning forward. "Not again," he muttered. The horse pawed at that same patch near the capped well, striking with a persistence that no fly or itch could explain. Each beat carried across the quiet like a drum, steady and strange. He rose, descending the porch steps, gravel crunching under his boots. The night smelled of dry cedar and old dust. The stars burned sharp overhead, and the moon poured silver onto the yard. Dusty's eyes caught that light, glinting with something almost human, pleading, insistent. "What are you after, boy?" Henry whispered. He laid a hand on the fence, feeling the vibration of each strike. The sound was hollow, different from the rest of the corral. It made his stomach twist. He climbed inside the pen, cautious, boots sinking into powdery earth. Dusty stepped back, making room, but didn't stop. Another blow of hoof against soil. Henry crouched and pressed his palm flat to the ground. Warmth lingered from the day, but beneath it, something else. Cooler, heavier, a breath rising from the deep. Henry's heart thudded. He scraped at the surface with his fingers, pulling loose clods away. The soil underneath was darker, damp, compared to the dust above. A smell rose, faint but distinct, earthy and sharp. He drew back, unsettled. Dusty dropped his head, snorting, and nudged Henry's shoulder. The message felt clear. Keep looking. Henry sat back on his heels, torn between curiosity and fear. What if it was nothing? What if he wasted the little strength he had on a hole in the dirt? But Sarah's words came back to him, soft as a prayer. Sometimes the land does find a way to answer back. He stood, brushing dirt from his palms, and looked down at Dusty. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, voice rough. "We'll see tomorrow." Dusty whickered low, almost a sigh, and stepped away as though satisfied with the promise. Henry climbed out of the corral and crossed back to the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. He sank into the chair and stared into the night, the echo of hooves still in his ears. Sleep was thin when it came. He woke to the faint sound of hoofbeats more than once, steady as a heartbeat outside his window. Each time, he lay still, listening until the rhythm blended with dreams. He saw flashes. Claire standing in the garden, dirt under her fingernails, saying this land keeps its secrets. He saw Michael racing Dusty along the fence line, laughter bright as bells. He woke with tears on his cheeks and the taste of dust in his mouth. Before dawn, he rose and pulled on his boots. The house felt smaller in the dark, walls pressing in with silence. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch just as the first line of light cut across the horizon. Dusty was already at the corner, waiting. The horse lifted his head, ears sharp, then struck the ground once more, a sound that split the morning quiet. Henry leaned against the post, exhausted, haunted, but unable to look away. Whatever secret the land held, Dusty wasn't letting him ignore it. Not anymore. By midweek, the sun over the panhandle glared down like a merciless overseer. Henry Walker sat at his kitchen table, calloused fingers tracing the rim of the chipped mug in front of him. He hadn't touched the coffee in 20 minutes. The letter from the bank still sat where he'd left it days ago, its edges curling, the words "Final Notice" staring at him like a dare. A low rumble outside drew him from his daze. Tires on gravel, a door shutting with a practiced slam. He didn't have to look to know who it was. The heat rose in his chest before Richard Cole even appeared in the doorway. "Morning, mister." "Walker," Richard said smoothly, stepping into the shade of the porch without waiting for permission. His shirt was as white and stiff as the first day, but today he carried a briefcase. That black leather case looked heavier than it was, not because of its contents, but because of what it meant. Henry didn't rise. He leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Didn't expect you this soon." Richard gave a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Friday's closer than you think. I wanted to give you a chance to reconsider before it's too late. The bank values cooperation. If you sign today, you'll still walk away with dignity." "Funny," Henry said flatly. "You all keep using that word like you own it." The smile faltered. Richard opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the table. "This is your last opportunity. Sign here, and the debt is cleared. You'll have enough left to start over somewhere smaller, maybe in Amarillo. No shame in downsizing." Henry stared at the papers. The weight of them seemed to press down on the table, heavier than any plow he'd ever hauled. His throat tightened. He thought of Claire's laughter in the kitchen, Michael's muddy boots by the door. He thought of Sarah's words about land that breathes. He pushed the papers back with the edge of his hand. "Not today." Richard's eyes cooled, his tone dropping its pleasant mask. "You're running out of time, Walker. When the clock strikes, the land won't be yours to keep or give away. It'll be ours. And no amount of sentiment will change that." Henry stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping across the floor. "You best leave now." Richard gathered the papers, lips pressed thin. "Very well. I'll see you Friday." He snapped the briefcase shut and walked out, his shoes clicking against the porch boards with a rhythm Henry despised. When the dust of the sedan finally settled, Henry sank back into his chair. His chest heaved, his hands trembling, though he hated to admit it. Dusty nickered softly from the corral, the sound like a question. Henry rubbed his face with both hands. "I know, boy. I know." That evening, as the sun slid low, Ethan Miller returned in his polished sedan, as if the two men had coordinated their attacks. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. He leaned on the porch railing, flashing a smile that could sell salt to the ocean. "You don't want the bank breathing down your neck, mister." "Walker, let me make it easier. I'll offer 20% more than they will. Cash. You could be gone by next week with a new start wherever you like." Henry looked past him to the fields, parched and empty. "And what do you see out there, Mr. Miller?" "A blank canvas," Ethan said smoothly. "Resorts, spas, cabins. People will pay a fortune for what you've wasted." Dusty stomped the ground in the corral, ears pinned, as if echoing Henry's own disgust. Henry's voice was steady, though his insides roiled. "This land raised my family. It buried them too. It's not a canvas. It's a graveyard. And I won't sell it to be painted over." Ethan's smile thinned. "Think it over. But don't take too long. Opportunities don't last." He slid back into his car and drove off, his words trailing behind like a shadow. When the night settled, Henry sat on the porch with his shotgun across his lap, though he hadn't carried it in years. He wasn't sure whether he meant to guard against coyotes or men. The cicadas hummed, and the stars burned cold. From the corral came the sound again. Dusty's hoof striking earth. Steady. Patient. Insistent. Henry listened, heart heavy but not broken. Somewhere beneath the weight of debt and threats, he felt the stirrings of something else. Not hope, not yet, but defiance, raw and unyielding, like the beat of a horse's hoof on hard Texas ground. The morning broke with a haze of dust that dulled the horizon, painting the world in shades of gray and gold. Henry Walker stepped out of the house, his body heavy with sleeplessness. Every day seemed to drag him closer to Friday. The date circled in his mind like a vulture overhead. But something in him shifted as soon as his boots hit the ground. Dusty was already waiting in the corral, ears pricked, eyes burning with insistence. The horse struck the earth again, same place, same rhythm. Thok, thok. The sound echoed into Henry's bones. He leaned on the fence, chest tightening. "All right," he muttered, reaching for the shovel propped against the barn. "You've been asking. Let's see what you're trying to tell me." Dusty watched with stillness that felt ceremonial. Henry swung the shovel into the ground where the horse had pawed. The blade clanged against hard soil, sending vibrations up his arms. He heaved, lifting clumps of packed dirt, sweat rising on his back within minutes. Dusty stood close, nostrils flaring, the steady breath of an overseer. After the third shovel load, Henry paused. The soil beneath was darker. Damp, almost. He crouched, scooping a handful into his palm. The texture clung, heavier than the powdery dust of the rest of the ranch. He sniffed, and a strange odor drifted up. Earthy, metallic, with a faint sharpness that made his throat tighten. "What the hell?" His words slipped into the wind. He dug again, faster now. Each stroke revealed more of that strange soil, black streaks that stained his fingers. He scraped deeper until the shovel hit something slick. He touched it with his hand, and when he pulled away, his skin glistened with a dark sheen. The smell was stronger now, sharp, oily, undeniable. Henry staggered back, staring at his hand. "Oil," he whispered, the word almost foreign on his tongue. Dusty blew through his nostrils as if in answer, tossing his head high. For a long while, Henry sat on the edge of the hole, staring at the black residue on his skin. The weight of it pressed down, heavier than the debt that had crushed him for months. Beneath this land, beneath the bones of his family and the promises he'd sworn, was something vast and powerful, something that could change everything. But fear tangled with awe. Oil wasn't just salvation. It was danger. Men like Richard and Ethan didn't circle land like vultures for no reason. They must have suspected, or hoped. If they knew what Dusty had led him to, they'd tear him apart to get it. He wiped his hand, on his jeans, leaving a smear that would not come out, and rose to his feet. Dusty stepped forward, pressing his warm muzzle into Henry's shoulder, steadying him. "You knew," Henry whispered. "Somehow, you knew." That night, he couldn't sit still. He paced the house, photographs of Claire and Michael looking down on him with silent eyes. He poured himself a glass of water, tasted metal where there was none. His body buzzed with restless energy, caught between terror and hope. He walked out into the dark. Dusty stood guard by the hole, as if protecting the secret. The stars shimmered, and the wind carried the dry scent of mesquite. Henry crouched at the edge again, staring into the shadowed earth. He imagined pipelines and drills, the land torn open. He imagined a ranch restored, debts erased, fences rebuilt, cattle in the fields again. He also imagined men in suits shaking his hand with smiles that hid knives. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." Dusty's ears flicked. The horse gave a low, steady whinny, a sound that wrapped around Henry's chest like a rope, pulling him back from the edge of despair. Henry straightened, shoulders squared. For the first time in months, he felt something that wasn't resignation. It wasn't quite victory. It was the crack of light breaking through the door of a dark room. Beneath his land was oil. Beneath his grief was possibility. And in Dusty's unrelenting rhythm, he had been told the truth. The earth itself was ready to speak. The discovery clung to Henry's skin long after the dirt had washed from his hands. He had stood over the sink that evening, scrubbing with lye soap, watching the dark sheen smear and thin but never fully vanish. Even after his palms came clean, he swore he could still smell it, that sharp, oily tang that didn't belong in a poor man's kitchen. It haunted him as he sat at the table, photographs staring back from the far wall, the house silent as a tomb. Dusty's soft wicker drifted through the window, steady and grounding. Henry rose, unable to bear the walls pressing closer, and walked out into the cool night. The stars blazed white and unblinking overhead, but he hardly noticed. All he saw was the outline of the horse, waiting near the corral fence, ears pricked toward him. Henry stepped inside, his boots crunching the dry earth until he reached the spot Dusty had been pawing for days. The shallow hole yawned there, its dark soil gleaming faintly even in moonlight. The smell was faint but distinct, riding the night air like a whisper. He crouched, staring at it, and felt his chest tighten. Dusty moved closer, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed Henry's shoulder. The warmth of the horse's breath melted what little resolve he had left. Henry's hands shook as he buried them in Dusty's mane, and without warning, tears broke free. "I can't do this alone," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. He pressed, his forehead against the horse's neck. The coarse hair was damp with sweat, the steady pulse beneath skin proof of a life more faithful than any human he'd known. "I promised her I'd never let this land go. But I'm so damn tired, Dusty. So tired." His shoulders heaved, the years of grief and debt and loneliness spilling out. He saw Claire's smile, felt Michael's hand tugging his own, and the ache of their absence split him wide open. Yet Dusty stood motionless, bearing the weight as though it belonged to him too. The horse's breath was slow, a rhythm that coaxed Henry back from the edge of despair. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time meant little under the vast Texas sky. Henry finally pulled back, wiping at his eyes with the heel of his hand. Dusty blinked, calm and patient, as though nothing had broken, nothing had shattered. Henry let out a shaky laugh. "You've got more patience than any preacher I've ever known." He rose and looked again at the dark soil. A part of him wanted to dig deeper, to know for sure what waited beneath. But another part, the part that had buried his wife and son on this land, hesitated. Oil might mean salvation, but it might also mean vultures, lawsuits, men like Richard and Ethan circling closer. Dusty nudged his arm again, insistent. Henry laid a hand on the gelding's cheek. "Maybe you're right. Maybe this is what she meant. Maybe the land really does keep secrets." That night, Henry barely slept. He lay awake, listening to the sounds of Dusty shifting in the corral, hooves scuffing now and then, tail swishing against flies. Each sound was a reminder that he wasn't as alone as he thought. When dawn broke, Henry saddled Dusty and rode out across the barren fields. The land stretched endless and silent, but in Henry's chest something had changed. Where despair had hollowed him, a fragile ember now glowed. He tightened his grip on the reins, guiding Dusty toward the ridge where he could see the whole ranch at once. From that height, the cracked fields still looked hopeless, the house still sagged, the fences still leaned. Yet Henry felt something new as the wind whipped across his face. Dusty shifted beneath him, steady and sure, as though carrying not just a rider, but the weight of a promise. Henry swallowed hard, his throat raw. "You saved me, boy," he said aloud, his voice catching in the wind. "You saved me." He leaned forward, wrapping his arms briefly around Dusty's neck, tears stinging again, but softer this time, tears that came not just from sorrow, but from gratitude. The land had spoken through his horse, and for the first time in years, Henry believed he might just have the strength to listen. The night pressed down on the ranch like a heavy hand. Henry Walker had eaten little, just a heel of bread and coffee strong enough to scrape the throat, before he doused the lamp and let darkness take the house. He lay in bed with his boots still on, listening to the old boards creak and settle. Outside, Dusty shifted in the corral, his movements steady, comforting. But sometime after midnight, the rhythm broke. A sharp snort, hooves striking harder than before, the sound urgent, not patient. Henry sat up, heart thudding. He reached for the shotgun propped against the wall and moved toward the window. At first, all he saw was the pale sweep of moonlight over the yard. Then movement, figures, 2, maybe 3, slipping along the fence line like shadows that had grown restless. He cursed under his breath and shoved his hat on. The door groaned as he opened it, and the men froze in the moonlight, caught like coyotes near a chicken coop. One scrambled toward the dry creek. The other 2 hesitated, eyes flashing white before they bolted. Dusty reared in the corral, ears flat, hooves pounding the ground so hard the sound rattled Henry's bones. "Get the hell off my land!" Henry roared, voice carrying across the empty fields. He fired a warning shot into the sky, the crack splitting the silence. The shadows ran faster, swallowed by mesquite and dust, until only the night remained. Henry lowered the gun, chest heaving. Dusty snorted and stamped, his body trembling with energy. But when Henry climbed into the corral and laid a hand against his neck, the horse stilled as though the touch had drained the storm out of him. "They'll be back," Henry muttered. He didn't know if he was speaking to the horse or to himself. He sat on the porch until the first gray light smeared the horizon, shotgun resting across his knees. Every noise, the call of a night bird, the rustle of weeds, set his nerves on edge. When the sun finally broke, the world looked the same. But Henry knew something had shifted. The land no longer carried only the weight of his memories and debts. It carried a secret someone else wanted badly enough to send men creeping in the dark. Later that morning, Sheriff Tom Briggs pulled his truck into the yard, dust rising behind him. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform worn at the seams, a man who'd known Henry since school days. He studied the ground near the fence, scuffed by hurried boots. "You're sure you saw them?" Tom asked. "I'm sure." Henry leaned on his shotgun. "They weren't boys looking for trouble." They were hunting something. Tom squatted, rubbing dirt between his fingers. "Word gets around, Henry." "Maybe somebody's heard there's value under this place. Could be the bank talking. Could be outsiders sniffing around." Henry stiffened. "You think Cole sent them?" The sheriff didn't answer directly. "I think you ought to be careful. Keep that gun close, and don't let anyone sweet-talk you into giving up what's yours." As the sheriff drove off, Henry felt the weight of his words settle deeper than the dust. He returned to the corral. Dusty stood near the hole, head bent, ears relaxed, but his eyes followed Henry with a sharpness that felt almost human. "You saved me again, boy," Henry said softly. "If it weren't for you, they'd have dug right here." He rubbed Dusty's muzzle, grateful for the steady breath against his palm. That night, Henry lit the lamp and sat at the table with the photographs of Claire and Michael. He stared long into their faces, then glanced toward the window where the stars burned cold. "They're circling us," he whispered, "but I won't let them take it. Not after what we found." The silence of the house gave no reply, but outside, Dusty pawed the ground once, twice. The sound echoed into the bones of the house itself, steady as a vow. Henry leaned back, exhaustion heavy, but resolve stronger than before. He had fought coyotes, droughts, and years of loss. Now he would fight men too. He closed his eyes, listening to the horse outside, and let the rhythm steady him until sleep finally came. The morning sun rose over the panhandle with the same merciless glare. But Henry Walker woke with a mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The night of shadows still haunted him, the figures slipping along his fence line, the flash of fear in their retreat. But the fear had settled into something harder. He couldn't carry the secret of the Black Earth alone. Not anymore. He needed someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't run to the bank or the city slickers with dollar signs in their eyes. He thought of a name he hadn't spoken in years. Pablo Serrano. Pablo had been an engineer in the oil fields before retirement, a friend of Henry's father, a man who had seen more wells drilled than Henry had crops harvested. Age had slowed him, but he was known for his quiet honesty. If anyone could tell Henry whether the black sheen in his soil was salvation or just another cruel trick, it would be Pablo. Henry saddled Dusty before the heat grew unbearable. The gelding moved beneath him with a steady confidence, hooves thudding against the dry earth like a heartbeat. Henry guided him toward the county road, the two of them cutting a lone figure across the endless flat. The ride into town was long, filled with ghosts. Henry passed the old feed store, its windows boarded, the schoolhouse Sarah still kept alive with stubborn will, the church steeple standing above houses where curtains twitched at the sight of him. Folks knew his troubles. In a town this small, whispers traveled faster than wind. He felt them watching as he dismounted outside Pablo's modest home on the edge of Main Street. Pablo answered the door slowly, his frame bent but his eyes alert. "Henry Walker," he said, surprise warming his tone. "Been a long time." "Too long," Henry admitted. "Can I come in?" The house smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. Maps of oil fields and geological surveys still lined the walls, relics of a career Pablo hadn't quite let go of. Henry reached into his satchel and drew out a small glass jar, its lid tight, the liquid inside catching the light. Pablo took it carefully, tilting it toward the sun streaming through the window. The dark fluid shimmered, thick and unmistakable. "Where'd you get this?" Pablo asked, voice low. "Out back of my corral," Henry said. He told the story, the horses pawing, the strange soil, the smell that clung to his skin. He left nothing out, not even the tears that had come when he realized what Dusty had led him to. Pablo listened without interrupting, his weathered hands turning the jar slowly, his face unreadable. When Henry finished, silence stretched. Finally, Pablo nodded. "It's oil." no question. Heavy crude, but clean enough to matter. He set the jar on the table between them. If there's enough under your land, Henry, it could change everything. The words struck Henry harder than any bank notice. Change everything. He felt both lifted and crushed. And if others find out? They already suspect, Pablo said grimly. That's why men are circling. The bank, the developers, they've got ears everywhere. But if you want to protect what's yours, you'll need more than a shotgun. You'll need paperwork, leases, rights filed in your name. Otherwise, someone will take it before you can blink. Henry rubbed his temples, the weight pressing in again. I never wanted riches. Just wanted to keep the land. Pablo leaned forward, his voice steady. Then keep it. Don't sell. Don't trust quick offers. Let the land work for you, not against you. I can put you in touch with folks who know the law, who can help you make this official. But you'll need to be careful. Oil doesn't just bring money. It brings wolves. Henry nodded slowly. Dusty's steady hoofbeats still echoed in his memory, urging him forward. I'll do whatever it takes. I won't let them win. Pablo clapped him on the shoulder. That's your father's grit, I see. Don't waste it. Henry left town with the jar tucked safe in his satchel. On the ride back, the sun beat down, but his thoughts ran hotter. Oil beneath his land, men circling like vultures, the promise of salvation tangled with danger. Dusty carried him home, the gelding stride strong and even, as if he too understood the burden they shared. That evening, Henry set the jar on the mantel above the cold fireplace. The dark liquid caught the lamplight, gleaming like a secret flame. He stood staring at it until his eyes burned. Then he turned toward the corral, where Dusty stood watch near the dark soil once more. You were right, boy, Henry whispered. You knew. Now it's on me to keep it safe. Dusty stamped the ground once, the sound resonant in the night air, as though sealing the vow. Henry Walker rode back from town with the glass jar tucked deep in his satchel, his mind buzzing louder than the cicadas in the ditches. Pablo's words replayed in his head. Oil changes everything, but it brings wolves. He had felt the truth of that in the way Richard's eyes sharpened, in the slick smile Ethan carried like a blade. Now he knew why they circled. His land wasn't just dying ground. It was treasure, hidden beneath cracked earth. The next day, as heat shimmered across the fields, Ethan Miller returned. His silver sedan rolled through the gate as though it already belonged there. Dusty flared his nostrils in the corral, stamping the ground once. Henry leaned on the porch post, arms crossed, shotgun resting close by, though he hadn't reached for it yet. Ethan climbed the steps with practiced ease, jacket slung over his shoulder. Mr. Walker, he said warmly, as if they were old friends. I'll save us both some time. The bank's deadline is tomorrow, and I know what they're offering. Pennies. I'm here to put real money on the table. 20% more. Cash. He pulled a folded contract from his pocket and laid it on the porch table. Sign tonight, and by morning you'll have a wire in your account. Henry didn't touch the paper. You seem mighty sure I'm ready to run. Ethan's smile deepened. Not run, Henry. Be free. Free from debt, free from backbreaking work, free from this ruin. He gestured at the dry fields, the sagging barn, the empty corrals. You deserve better than watching the land rot under your boots. Dusty let out a sharp whinny, cutting the air like a warning. Henry's jaw tightened. He thought of Claire's words, of Sarah's gentle reminder that the land breathes. He thought of the jar on his mantel, dark liquid gleaming like a secret fire. "I'm not signing," he said simply. Ethan's mask slipped for a heartbeat. His eyes hardened, then smoothed again. "Think carefully. Men who refuse good offers often end up with nothing." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And sometimes accidents happen. A fire, a break-in, a missing horse. Be wise, Mr. Walker." Henry felt the words like a knife pressed to his ribs. His hand twitched toward the shotgun, but he didn't lift it. Instead, he leaned in until his face was inches from Ethan's. "Get off my porch." Now, for a moment, silence burned between them, heavy and dangerous. Then Ethan smiled again, folding the contract with casual fingers. "Suit yourself. But remember, you turned down the last good hand you'll ever be dealt." He stepped off the porch, shoes crunching gravel, and slid into his sedan. The car roared to life and sped away, throwing dust across the fence line. Henry sank into the chair, his pulse hammering. Dusty watched from the corral, ears pinned, eyes bright with something that looked too much like understanding. As dusk fell, Richard Cole arrived in his dark sedan. 2 visits in one day, one sweet as poison, the other bitter as law. Richard climbed the porch with his briefcase, setting it down with authority. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone clipped. "This is it. The bank will file foreclosure in the morning if you don't sign. You'll lose everything. House, land, what little equipment you have left. We're giving you the chance to walk away clean." Henry shook his head slowly. "Clean? You call it clean to rip a man from the land he buried his family in?" Richard sighed, pushing the papers toward him. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "You've fought long enough. Let it go." Henry looked past him at the horizon, where the last light bled orange into the sky. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not signing." Richard studied him, frustration sparking in his eyes. He snapped the briefcase shut. "Then you'll regret it." Without another word, he marched to his car and drove away, leaving the porch vibrating in his wake. Henry sat alone in the twilight, Dusty's steady silhouette visible against the dimming sky. He felt the trap closing. The bank's cold grip on one side, Ethan's smooth menace on the other. But beneath his boots, beneath the cracked soil, pulsed the secret that gave him strength. He stood, walking to the corral, and laid his forehead against Dusty's neck. The horse's breath was warm, steady. "They think they've got me," Henry whispered. "But they don't know what we know." "Not yet," Dusty snorted, stamping once, sealing the vow in the dark. The heat came early that day, rising before the sun had cleared the mesquite on the horizon. Henry Walker wiped sweat from his brow, though it wasn't yet mid-morning. The land lay still as if stunned, cicadas buzzing with a feverish pitch. He had tried to keep busy, mending a hinge on the barn door, clearing weeds from the fence line, but every nail he drove and every weed he pulled carried the weight of the deadline pressing in. By the time the sun leaned west, his body was weary, and his mind carried the kind of sharpness that comes only from knowing danger circles close. Dusty was restless in the corral. The gelding's ears flicked, his tail lashed at flies, and he kept pacing toward that same corner, pawing the ground with more insistence than ever before. Henry leaned against the fence, studying him. "I know, boy," he muttered. "I hear it too." As dusk settled, the air grew strange. The heat didn't ease. Instead, it thickened, a hot wind sweeping across the plains with a sound like whispers. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an owl called. Long, hollow, and unsettling. Henry froze. In all his years on this land, owls had been rare. His grandmother used to say they were messengers, warnings carried on feathered wings. Dusty threw up his head, eyes wide, ears pricked toward the call. Then he struck the ground again, harder than before. Henry's gut tightened. He lit the lantern on the porch, the flame struggling in the uneasy wind. That was when he saw it. Movement near the fence line, quick and low. Shadows slipping through the mesquite, too deliberate to be deer, too quiet to be coyotes. Henry grabbed the shotgun propped by the door and strode into the yard. "Who's there?" he shouted. His voice cracked the silence, but the figures didn't answer. Dusty screamed, a high, sharp whinny, and charged the corral rail, hooves pounding. The sound spurred Henry forward. He raised the gun, firing a warning shot into the air. The owl's cry answered, eerie and drawn out, just as the shadows scattered into the brush. Breath ragged, Henry held his ground until the stillness returned. The only sounds left were the rasp of the hot wind and Dusty's heavy breathing. He walked into the corral, lantern light swinging, and laid a hand on the horse's neck. The hide was damp, the muscles trembling beneath his touch. "You saved me again, old boy," he whispered. Later, after settling Dusty and checking the locks on every door, Henry sat at the kitchen table with the jar of oil in front of him. The dark liquid caught the lantern's glow, reflecting back a wavering light. He thought of Pablo's warning, of Ethan's threats, of Richard's cold insistence. "Wolves," Pablo had said. Tonight proved the truth of it. The owl called again, farther away this time. Henry clenched his fists. He had faced drought. He had faced death. But this was different. This was men who would stop at nothing to claim what was not theirs. He bowed his head into his hands, exhaustion pressing down. But beneath the weariness burned something sharper. Defiance. When he finally stepped onto the porch again, the night was still. The moon hung low, casting the land in silver. Dusty stood guard in the corral, eyes glinting, ears forward. The horse pawed the earth once, deliberate, a vow Henry felt deep in his chest. He lifted the shotgun and rested it across his knees as he sat. The hot wind curled around the porch posts, carrying dust and whispers. The owl's cry faded into the distance. Henry closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of Dusty's hooves shifting in the dirt, and made himself a promise. Come what may, he would not bend, not to the bank, not to the wolves from the city, not to fear itself. The land had chosen to speak through his horse. Now it was his turn to answer. The dawn came harsh and colorless, the sun climbing like a blade over the horizon. Henry Walker stood on the porch with his hat low and his jaw set. The night before had left its mark. Strange shadows at the fence line. Dusty's screams. The owl's call echoing in the heat. He was tired, older than his years, but something inside had hardened into steel. Enough running from fear. Enough waiting for wolves. He saddled Dusty and rode into town. The gelding's hooves struck the packed dirt road with a rhythm that carried Henry's resolve. Main Street was just stirring, the diner clattering with breakfast pans, A couple of pickups parked crooked outside the hardware store. But Henry's destination wasn't food or supplies. He dismounted in front of the lawyer's office, a squat brick building that still smelled of ink and dust. Inside, the air was cool, the walls lined with shelves of thick books. Behind the desk sat Samuel Greer, an old attorney who had drafted half the wills and land deeds in the county. He looked up from his spectacles, blinking. "Henry." "Been a long time." Henry laid the jar of dark oil on the desk. The lawyer raised his brows but said nothing, waiting. Henry's voice was steady. "I need to file. Mineral rights, leases, whatever it takes to put this in my name and keep it there." Samuel leaned back, folding his hands. "You're sure?" "Never been more." The lawyer studied him, then nodded. "It won't be quick, and it won't be easy. Men will contest. But you've got the law if you move now. I'll draw up the papers." As Henry signed his name to the first document, a weight lifted off him. Not the weight of debt, not yet, but the weight of silence. For weeks, he had carried the secret alone, afraid of the truth beneath his land. Now it was written in ink, his claim marked in the ledgers of the county. When he stepped back into the daylight, he found Sarah Lopez waiting on the wooden sidewalk. She carried a basket of books from the schoolhouse, her hair pinned against the wind. "You look different," she said, smiling softly. Henry tipped his hat. "Made a choice." "And what choice is that?" "To stay. To fight for what's mine." Sarah's eyes warmed, though worry lingered. "They won't make it easy, Henry. Men like Ethan don't walk away empty-handed." "I know," he said simply, "but I've run out of fear." On the ride home, the sky was a hard blue, the kind that promised another scorcher. Dusty carried him steady, ears flicking as if proud of the burden. At the ranch, Henry unsaddled him and let him drink deep from the trough. Then he walked the fence lines, not as a man counting what was about to be lost, but as one preparing to defend what was his. Every sagging post he straightened felt like a statement. Every strand of wire he pulled tight sang like a vow. That evening, he sat on the porch with the shotgun across his knees. The jar of oil rested inside on the mantel, glowing faint in the lamplight. He could feel the land humming beneath his boots, restless, alive. Dusty stood watch in the corral, head high, his shadow long against the fading light. As the sun dropped, a car appeared on the distant road, kicking dust behind it. Henry didn't rise. Whoever it was, banker, developer, stranger in the night, would find him waiting. He no longer felt the tremor of fear in his chest. What filled him instead was the raw, unshakable calm of a man who had decided. He laid a hand on Dusty's withers as the horse pressed close to the fence. "This is our stand, boy. Whatever comes, we meet it here." Dusty snorted, stamping once, as if sealing the pact. The wind stirred hot across the plains, but Henry no longer heard it as threat. He heard it as witness. The first light of morning spilled across the Texas, plains, thin at first, then bold, painting the horizon in hues of rose and gold. Henry Walker stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath his boots. For the first time in months, he didn't carry the letter from the bank in his pocket, didn't wake with dread chewing at his chest. The ink on the documents he'd signed yesterday was still drying, his rights claimed and his decision sealed. Whatever storm was coming, he was ready. Dusty stood in the corral, mane lifted by the dawn breeze, eyes watchful. Henry walked over, opened the gate, and the gelding stepped out freely, circling once before coming to rest beside him. The horse pressed his warm muzzle into Henry's shoulder, and Henry let his hand rest there, steady, grounded. "We made it this far, old boy," he said softly, "and we're not turning back." He saddled Dusty, not out of need, but out of ritual. Together they rode to the ridge, the path familiar, the land stretching wide below them. The fields still bore scars of drought, cracked soil, weeds clinging stubbornly. But in the light of morning they seemed less like wounds and more like maps. Maps of where he had been, what he had lost, and what he had chosen to protect. At the crest, Henry dismounted and let Dusty graze on the sparse grass. He stood alone, looking down at the land where Claire's garden had once bloomed, where Michael had run with the dogs, where laughter had filled the air before silence claimed it. The cottonwoods marked the family plot, branches swaying faint in the wind. Henry walked to them, hat in hand, and lowered his head. "I kept my word," he whispered, voice breaking but steady. "This land is still ours." They tried to take it, but I didn't bend. I couldn't. He pressed his palm to the rough bark, imagining Claire's hand over his, Michael's laughter somewhere on the breeze. Behind him, Dusty whinnied, a low, steady sound that carried across the ridge like an amen. Henry turned, eyes wet, and smiled through the ache. The sun lifted higher, flooding the valley in light. Henry mounted again, and Dusty carried him back toward the house. Each hoofbeat felt like punctuation to a vow. This was their land, their fight, their story. The ranch might never look like it once did, but it was alive again, alive with promise, with the hum of oil beneath its skin, with the heartbeat of a man and his horse refusing to surrender. When they reached the yard, Henry unsaddled Dusty and let him roam free. The gelding trotted toward the well, circling once before stopping to paw the earth, the same way he had from the start. Only this time, Henry didn't hear it as warning. He heard it as remembrance, as victory. He stood long in the yard, the morning wrapping around him, the house behind him no longer just a hollow shell, but a place with breath again. Dusty's shadow stretched beside his own, two figures bound by something stronger than fear or loss, by trust, by loyalty, by the strange, unshakable language the land had chosen to speak through the hooves of a horse. Henry lifted his face to the sun, the weight in his chest finally easing. "We're still here," he said, "and we always will be." Dusty tossed his head, mane flashing in the light, and for a moment it seemed the whole ranch bowed with him. The day had only just begun, but for Henry Walker, it was already enough. And now, I want to hear from you. If you believe Dusty was more than just a horse, drop a simple one in the comments. If you think it was pure luck, type 0. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe, because more true and emotional stories of humans and animals are waiting for you. Stay with us, and let the next story touch your heart again.